Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a video on the most frequently asked questions that I get about soap making. Some of my soap making videos have been really popular and I'm so pleased about it. It's really exciting and I love to help people answering their questions. I make time to answer every single question and comment on my YouTube channel. At the moment I can manage that, and it's really nice way to give back and thank everybody for their support. But there are definitely some frequently asked questions that I thought it would definitely be useful to put them all together in one video, and then I can use that as a resource that I can link people to when they ask those questions, so I don't have to answer them all the time. So I've got all my questions written out here on my little tablet. I'm going to go through them one by one. So number one, the most commonly asked question I get is, isn't lye dangerous? Do I have to use it? Are there any alternatives? Okay, so that was 3 questions in one, but really the question's all about lye and using lye in soap, and is that safe because it's such a dangerous product, I guess. The answer to that is yes, lye is really dangerous in itself as a substance, and the lye that is used to make bar soap is sodium hydroxide. It's also often labelled as caustic soda, but that substance in itself is very dangerous. You need to follow some pretty strict safety measures when you're making soap because it's dangerous. However, when lye is emulsified with oils in the right quantities and it's done the right way, those 2 things then become one thing, a third thing called soap. So in the finished soap, once the lye and the oils have been emulsified, they undergo a chemical reaction called saponification, and then through that reaction the oils become soap and the lye is transformed into soap as well with the oils. So there's no excess lye in a soap recipe that's been well calculated. So soap is safe to use, even if it has been made with lye, which is a very unsafe product. It is safe to use. Unfortunately, there aren't any alternatives to lye in soap making unless you're making synthetic detergents and other types of things. But when you're talking about traditional soap making that's made with oils, that needs to have a really strong caustic solution made of sodium hydroxide for bar soap in order to make the soap. So no alternatives, I'm afraid. Not that I know of anyway. Question number 2. Can I use coconut oil or some other kind of oil in this recipe instead of olive oil? So I've had this question many times on my Castile soap recipe video, and the answer is no. Well, yes and no. Yes, you can use other oils in a soap recipe, but every time you change the oils in a recipe, the recipe needs to be recalculated. And the reason for that is that every oil used in soap making, or every oil for that matter, has a different fatty acid profile. So oils are fatty acids, and different oils have different fatty acid profiles. So there's lots of different types of fatty acids within oils, and they have different profiles, different saponification values, which means that they need a different amount of lye to turn them into soap. So yes, you can use different oils, but you need to recalculate the recipe and make sure that the lye amount is the same. And for some oils it will be similar, for some it won't be. I do have a video to show people how to calculate their own soap recipes, which a lot of people have found really helpful. So I'll put a link to that in the description box, and I hope that helps if you want to make up your own recipes, which is the way to go. Not everybody wants to make olive oil soaps like me. Number 3, I don't have a stick blender. What else can I use? So a stick blender is really ideal for soap making because the moving part that whizzes around the oil and the lye is submerged under the soap. Like, it's handy with an immersion blender because it's immersed under the soap. You don't get any splashing. And with soap making, because the raw soap batter is quite caustic. You don't want splashing. So that's why a stick blender is ideal, but I do get that not everybody can access a stick blender or can go to a shop and buy one. I get soap making questions from all over the world, and I'm in places where they might not have access to those kind of things. You can use a whisk, but it would take a long time. You can just stir it with a spoon, but again, it would take a very long time. I've never done that myself. If you have access to an egg beater, that could be a good non-electrical way to do it. Really, you're just wanting to agitate the soap a lot to get the lye and the oils to emulsify. That's what we're after. The other thing would be an electric whisk might work well, and I do know somebody that uses a stand mixer with the beater or the whisk attachment. I'm not sure, like a KitchenAid stand mixer with a steel bowl. They make the soap in there. I think I prefer the stick blender because it's kind of nice and safe and it's under the surface and there's no splashing, but if you can manage the safety aspect of things, you can use whatever you like. I have, as I said, I've never tried it, but if you were going to use a spoon or just a hand spoon or a hand whisk, what I would try would be to mix it for a while, then leave it. Then come back, mix it for a while, then leave it, maybe 20 minutes each time, because that saponification reaction will start to take place, and once it starts to happen, it's much easier to blend everything. So I don't know, that'd be worth trying out. I haven't done much research on that. So yeah, stick blender is ideal, but there are other ways to do it as well. Soap's been made for a really long time without stick blenders. Oh, the other thing to say would be a hot process soap making method could work really well without a stick blender, because the heat really speeds up the saponification reaction. So, if you're cooking the soap in a slow cooker or whatever method you're using to make a hot process soap, you could probably do that without a stick blender. Hope that helps for that one. Okay, number 4. Do you have to have a second set of utensils just for soap making? No, you don't. You can use just your regular utensils and spoons in your kitchen for soap making, as long as you clean them properly after that. After you use them, they should be fine. So stainless steel is fine. Number 5, polypropylene plastic is fine. Those two are quite stable with soap batter. I would steer clear though of wood. Anything wood will just get sort of deteriorated and eaten up a little bit by the lye. And also aluminium. I wouldn't use anything with aluminium because that will react quite strongly with the lye as well. Oh, glass. So Pyrex glass, that's pretty good too. I do happen to have my own set of soap utensils. I thought I'd show you this. And that's only because my little stick blender's in there too. That's only because when I first started soap making, I was so obsessed with it. I had to have everything, perfect, and had to have my own soap utensils. But honestly, you can use the same spatulas and things for cooking. Just clean them properly. I do have a video on tips for cleaning your soap utensils, so I'll link to that below as well. That's a really handy one. Sorry, Kevy, my cat's just joined me. He's heard me talking and he wants to join the party. Number 5, what is trace? So I have explained this in my beginner soap making video, but I'll touch on it again. So trace is really just when you're blending your soap batter, you're looking for the batter to emulsify. You want the lye solution and the oils to emulsify. And when they emulsify, that means they combine together really well and they start that reaction happening. When that reaction starts, the soap batter starts to thicken. And trace is really just a way of looking out for that thickening, because once you've got that batter starting to thicken, You know that you don't need to mix it anymore and you can pour the soap into the mould. So the trace is just when you lift up your stick blender or your spoon or whatever you're using to mix your soap, you can lift it up and trail a little bit of the batter on top of the mixture. And if you see it leave a little trace, like it sort of sits on the surface a little bit, or it leaves a trail, that's trace. So soap makers use that term all the time. Once I get to trace, then I pour my soap. So that's what you're looking for, just that tracing of the soap batter that shows that it's thickened. That's all that is. Number 6, my soap went really hard before I could pour it in the mould. What happened? Okay, there's a couple of reasons why your soap might get really hard and make it difficult to pour into the mould. Probably the number one thing that I've experienced with that is that a fragrance oil or an essential oil that I've poured in at the end has accelerated the trace. So some fragrance oils and some essential oils can really speed up the thickening of that soap, and it thickens before your eyes, and then you're trying to get this gloppy mess into the mould. The other thing that can accelerate the trace and thicken your soap really, really fast is if the ingredients are hot. So, you know, if you're using hot process soap making, then that's what you want, and that's fine, it will thicken up. You just keep stirring and wait for it to go through all the other stages. But in cold process soap making, you still want it to be runny enough to be able to pour. So making sure that your lye solution isn't too hot, making sure that your oils aren't too hot. I use everything at room temperature most of the time, and that gets around that issue. There are different oils and things that can accelerate the trace. So if it's not an oil that you're using, or a fragrance oil or an essential oil that is accelerating the trace, then it's usually heat, I think. Number 7, my soap is too soft. What happened? So when I get this question, my first thing I think of is, how long has it been since you made it? Because your soap will be soft for up to a day or two. Some of my soaps, the Castile soap, the olive oil soaps, are quite soft, and they do take a couple of days to harden up in the mould. It depends on the water amount in your soap. So that's usually the first thing. People just need to wait a little bit longer for their soap to harden. If the soap looks like it's separated and there's some oily stuff on the top and it's squidgy and soft, that's a bit of a worry. That could be a sign that the soap wasn't emulsified properly and you've got some separation. So that can be an issue. What else could it be? Sometimes if you haven't measured the ingredients properly, it could mean that you might not have enough lye in the soap, so there's not enough sodium hydroxide to saponify all the oils, so it doesn't set up properly. But the main reason why people's soap doesn't harden up, in my experience, like when I've asked them questions and dug a little bit deeper, it's usually because they just need to wait a little bit longer. I would say if your soap batter looks quite uniform and smooth and even and there's no oily bits, just leave it longer, it will probably harden up. Number 8, my soap is really crumbly and hard to cut. What happened? Well, that's another thing too. Your soap can be a bit soft, or it could also be really, really hard and crumbly and hard to cut. The main reason for that in a pretty straightforward soap recipe would be, I think, that the lye may have been measured incorrectly and the soap could be lye heavy. So a soap that has too much lye in it, so too much sodium hydroxide, it can make the soap really hard and crumbly. And if you tested that soap with a pH test strip, that would tell you. You could leave the soap for a couple of days, test it, and if it doesn't test at 8 or 9 pH, you'd know that there's an issue with the amount of sodium hydroxide in the soap, so that can make a soap hard and crumbly. The other thing with that is I would ask, what recipe did you use? Because there are some recipes that will make really hard soaps. So for example, if you're using a lot of hard butters or waxes in your soap, that could make your soap really crumbly. If you're using a lot of salt in your soap, so if you're making a salt bar, or a salt bar with a lot of coconut oil in it, using oils that make really rock hard soap, they can be crumbly when you cut them. Some of those soaps you've got to cut early before they get too hard, you know, within a few hours even. So that could be it. There's lots of reasons for that. Number 9, my soap has oily parts on the top. What happened? Well, I mentioned that one before. Sometimes if the soap batter isn't emulsified properly, there can be some separation in the mould. So you've mixed your soap and you think it's all saponified. Maybe you didn't check that you reached the trace. Sorry, you think it's all emulsified, and you think you've got the trace, but maybe you haven't. You can pour it out and it can look fine, and then you can come back 12 hours or a day later and see that it's all oily on the top and it's separated. That's usually the reason why. So you can recook that soap using a hot process method if you like. That's probably the only way to save it, really, is just to put the soap back into a slow cooker or something and cook it out and re-melt it down and get all of that lye saponified with the oils. That's a big answer, that one. Number 10, do you have to cure your soap for 4 to 6 weeks? Yes, you do. The main long period of time for curing soap is actually about drying the soap out. In terms of a chemical curing period of time, so the time from when you first mix the soap to when it's actually safe to use and it's fairly neutral, that's pretty quick. That takes place within a couple of days. You can test your soap after a few days, or 3 or 4 days, and it's usually neutralised, like it's safe to use by then. But the soap's still soft because there's a fair bit of water in a lot of soap recipes. They need a long period of time to really dry out and harden. You can use them before they're hard, but they don't last very long. They dissolve, in the shower. They're going to kind of go soggy. So the longer you can leave them, the better. Having said that, soaps really, because they're made with oils, they do, I think they're better if you use them within about 6 to 12 months, depending on how you store them as well. So yeah, you do have to dry out your soaps for about 4 to 6 weeks. I think 6 weeks is a good minimum. Depends on the recipe though. I use really low water amounts in my recipes, so that means that the soaps get harder and drier sooner because I'm using less water to start with. So that's a good trick too. But that's another big subject which I won't go into here. I will go into that here. Question 11. Your water amount seems low in your recipes. Soap Calc told me to use a lot more water. Why is that? Alright, so Soap Calc, which is a soap calculator that a lot of people use, and I show you how to use that in my video on how to calculate your own soap recipes. It sets the water level for soap recipes at a default level of 38%. Now that 38% means the water amount is 38% of the total oil amount. So say if you've got 1,000 grams or 1 kilogram of oil, your water amount based on Soap Calc's default level, if you don't change it, it will be 38% of that, which would be 380 grams. So that's a fair amount of water in a soap recipe. I think it's too much. I think soaps are much better if you use a lot less water. There is a certain amount that, there's a minimum amount that you need, and I do discuss this in my video on how to formulate and calculate your own soap recipe, so I won't go into it in too much depth here, but that's the reason. So I choose to use a different water amount than Soap Calc tells you to. A lot of websites and bloggers and different people will say, oh, you've got to use 38% water, it's a really good amount. I don't think so. I think soap is much better if it's got less water in it. It cures harder. You don't get any shrinkage when it cures, because with the higher water soaps, they've got so much water in them that when they dry out, they kind of shrink a little bit and you get this funny shape to them. So that's my answer to that one. Number 12, do you need to calculate the fragrance oil amount into your soap recipe, or is that an extra ingredient? The answer to that is no. You don't need to calculate that into your main soap recipe. Any fragrance oils or essential oils they're added in addition to the main soap recipe, so you don't have to worry about them in your calculations. You just work out how much of them you want in your recipe and add them in. You don't have to put them in soap calc. Another soap calc question. I noticed your recipes don't come out within the recommended ranges in soap calc. Does that matter? No, none of my recipes come out within the recommended ranges in soap calc. So soap calc and most soap calculators will, based on the formulation of your recipe, it will tell you where your recipe stands in terms of certain soap qualities, so hardness, conditioning, fluffy lather, creamy lather, different sorts of qualities, because all the different oils create different qualities in the finished soap. Most of my soaps are made with predominantly olive oil, and most of them nearly like over 80% olive oil. An olive oil soap has a low lather, it does not have an exciting lather at all, and it also is not a very hard bar of soap, depending on how you cure it and how you use it. But it's not hard like a soap would be if it was full of shea butter or cocoa butter or really hard oils, or palm oil, which I don't use. I personally really love the feel of olive oil soaps on my skin, and I think they're just lovely to use, so that's what I choose to use. But soap calc will tell you that it's not hard enough, it's too conditioning, it's all these things wrong with it. But I just don't worry about that. I make my soap out of whatever oil I want to use, and olive oil soaps have been made for millennia across the world, so I think that's okay. Olive oil soap was around before soap calc, so that's my thinking. Anyway, okay, must be nearly here, nearly at the end. Number 14, why don't you use distilled water for your soap recipes? What water should I use? My view on water for soap recipes is that if you have water that is fine for you to drink, for you to put in your body, for you to wash your body in, then it's going to be perfectly fine to make soap with. So I just use tap water or filtered tap water, or whatever water I use for drinking. We do have a filter on our kitchen tap, so I use that water. But the town water here in Brisbane is perfectly fine too. There's no issue with it. I don't see why you need to have distilled water in your soap making recipes. I've been making soap for years, just using tap water, and they're lovely. So there's no problem at all. Use your own drinking water, whatever that is, and that's all you need. Last question. This is exciting. I saved the big one for last. Number 15. What is super fat? Okay. Super fat is a great term. I love saying it. Super fat. I'm getting a bit sweaty under this light. It's actually a really hot day here, and I'm in the kitchen with everything shut because all the bird noises outside are really loud. Anyway, it's a bit warm. So what is super fat? Super fat is a small amount of excess oils calculated into your soap recipe. So when you work out your soap recipe in soap calc or whatever soap calculator you use, there is a little section where it says super fat, and it will usually default to about 5%, but you can use anywhere between 1% or 0% even. You don't have to have a super fat, and as much as you want depending on the soap recipe. Super fat really is just that little excess oil in your recipe. It does a couple of things. It acts as a bit of a pH buffer, so if there's something slightly wrong in your weighing or measuring of ingredients and your soap might have a little bit too much lye in it, the super fat can act as a bit of a buffer of that. So you've got some extra oil in there to saponify with some of that excess lye. If you've got excess lye in your recipe, hopefully you don't. Hopefully your super fat just does stay as an excess. Superfat is also added as a conditioning element to the soap. So having some extra free oils that aren't saponified, because they're excess to what the recipe actually needs, those oils don't get saponified, so they don't get turned into soap. So that means that within your soap bar there is some free oil in there which can help to make the soap conditioning. The thing with superfat is that some people calculate it into their main recipe, so that just as a part of their total oil batch, and they don't separate it out or add it in at any other point. They just, it's just part of the recipe, just with a little bit of an excess calculated. That's the way I do it. Some people, more clever than me, separate their superfat. They will calculate that separately, and they might even use a different oil to their main recipe batch as a superfat. That's a really big discussion itself in why you would do superfats different ways, but the question is, what is superfat? That's really what it is. It's an excess amount of oil in your soap recipe, put there for different reasons, as I explained. Well, there we go. I got to the end of that. That was quite a marathon. I hope that was helpful for some of you, if not all of you. Please feel free to ask any more questions that you've got. I'm not trying to get out of answering questions. I really love to interact with everybody on this channel and provide you all with as much support as I can with your soap making or bread making or whatever it is that you're doing. I appreciate your support and your feedback and comments and questions all the time. Hope you enjoyed that. Until I see you in the next video, bye for now. See ya.